Hello, Professor. How are you doing?
Hey, Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Richardson. You know me. You're on my Facebook. And this is Professor Michael Krenn, author of Black Diplomacy and the Color of Empire, Race and Foreign Relations. And Professor, you and I talked a couple months ago, and we talked a little bit about the State Department and race relations and sort of the history of race at the State Department.
Right.
And since the last time we talked, there have been a ton of reports, a ton of writing, a ton of stuff being produced about this topic of race and foreign policy. And so I wanted to talk to you again to get your perceptions of these new reports that have come out. FP21 did a report, Council of Foreign Relations did a report, the Truman National Security Project did a report. The Belfer Center did a report. The State Department itself has announced that it wants this new chief diversity officer. There have been lots and lots of talk about reform, but I want to talk a little bit first about the past reforms and past efforts to reform the State Department and how those fit into the context about what is going on today. So I want to start off by talking about a success story of reform at the State Department, and that was breaking of the Negro Circuit. So first off, could you talk a little bit about what was the Negro Circuit and how was it broken?
Well, the Negro Circuit was essentially the very, very limited number of foreign posts that African American diplomats, specifically the very small number of African American Foreign Service officers, could be sent. And it was essentially from Liberia to the Azores to the Canary Islands to Madagascar, and usually right back to Liberia. And that was about 98% of all of the years, if you took combined, of the African American diplomats from 1924 right up through World War II.
And that was like 53 years, basically, or 50 something years?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was, 24 to 25 years. Yeah. And that was the situation when World War II came to an end. Very, very few African American Foreign Service officers, and those who were there, their career opportunities were unbelievably limited.
Mm-hmm. And so you had like this Negro Circuit going on. Black officers weren't allowed to serve, but in these 4 different posts. I think you talked about how Clifton Wharton and some others, basically, they started in Liberia, and then they would just basically spend, multiple years in Liberia. But even among Foreign Service specialists, they often spent their entire career in Liberia.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It was very rare to have an African American transferred out of Liberia or any of those other parts of the Negro Circuit to anywhere else. It was not exactly unheard of, but generally speaking, maybe Haiti. But that was it. That was the limit of their career opportunities, and that was the way the State Department ran things.
And so we talk about this notion. I think Jennifer Brickenhoff brought this up about institutional entrepreneurs. Who were some of the institutional entrepreneurs who broke that system of the Negro Circuit in the early 50s and late 40s?
Well, yeah, it really took an interesting combination. In 1948, Edward Dudley got appointed the minister to Liberia, which was traditional. African Americans had traditionally been named to be the minister to Liberia. But the very next year, in 1949, he was promoted to the ambassador. We raised our status there to embassy level, and he became the first African American ambassador. And Dudley really formed an interesting working relationship with some members of the Department of State, including Chester Bowles, who was our ambassador to India at that time, and George McGee, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern, South Asian, and African Affairs. Together, what they did was basically plan a line of attack to break the Negro Circuit. Edward Dudley was always a fighter for civil rights. He was a former NAACP lawyer, and he was a very savvy politician. And so what he developed in working with Chester Bowles and George McGee was a sort of 2-track approach. First, he argued that, the appointment of more African Americans and to more diverse postings would actually rebound to the civil rights issue at home. If the presidential administration of Truman would embrace this idea, it would pay dividends politically here at home. But he was also very savvy because he linked it to foreign policy issues. He made this point again and again that the appointment of African Americans, not just to Liberia, but to a variety of different postings, would one speak to the people of color of the world. These people and these nations that were now just breaking out from colonialism would look upon that as a sign of America's commitment to democracy and freedom and equality. But it would also be a very effective answer against communist propaganda about the race issue. And so working with McGee, working with Chester Bowles, Dudley just kept pounding at the Department of State until he succeeded with his allies within the Department of State in breaking that Negro circuit. Suddenly you saw Charles Hanson was the first person. He went to Zurich. But other people went to Rome. Other people went to other postings around the world. And although the numbers of African Americans did not increase dramatically, and Dudley was the only African American to be appointed an ambassador by Truman, that was an important step of having that Negro circuit finally broken.
Okay, right. And so what you're saying is that, and then also on the outside, let's not forget that the NAACP, Congress, and other people were also pushing the State Department to break this Negro circuit. And so what you saw back then was this idea of both an external pressure and an internal pressure pushing together and working together to break up the Negro circuit. And that's how you found success in reforming the State Department back then.
That's exactly right. Just shortly after Dudley and his allies succeeded in breaking the Negro circuit, a group of African-American leaders, including A. Philip Randolph and Walter White, Mary McLeod Bethune, met with Truman in February of 1951 and presented a series of concerns and a series of really demands to do something about what was known in the African-American press and newspapers and magazines as the Lily White Club. And following up on that very quickly, another group of African-American leaders, including some of the same folks, Randolph, for example, but Rayford Logan, Theodore Brown, they met with Atchison, Secretary of State Atchison, just a couple of months later. That meeting did not go as well. Atchison was, as many of the participants described, particularly sensitive about this issue, and promised, however, that there would be a forthcoming report about the issues and what the Department of State would do about it. Unfortunately, that report did not appear until after the Truman administration left office. But I think your point is well taken. It took these external and internal forces to really make this an effective effort during the Truman period.
And it's fascinating because, during that meeting, you basically had the top African-American leaders, the head of the NAACP, the head of the Urban League, like the top of the top. And they had 6 demands, given all the things going on in the country, they had 6 demands. And one of those demands was to create a better foreign service and a more diverse State Department and to break the Negro circuit. And so that's how high a priority this was at that time. And what's interesting is that, a lot of people say, well, what if the next president doesn't have the same kind of commitment to it? And that's interesting because when Eisenhower was elected, he didn't have that commitment to diversity at the State Department. In fact, they cut the State Department budget and laid off foreign service officers. But the Negro circuit being broken, they couldn't undo that, right? Like they couldn't put people back in those other former countries anymore. And so that's why it's important to have that sense of people on the inside who are going to continue to work at these things and not just stop because there's a new administration.
Right. I mean, the Eisenhower years were, there wasn't any significant progress. There were a few more African-American ambassadors, 2 of them to Liberia and 1 to Guinea. But there wasn't at least much returning to normality. Once that Negro circuit was broken, it was broken. But yeah, Eisenhower didn't have much interest in the issue. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, his argument was that you really couldn't get African Americans through the security clearances because so many of them belonged to these suspect civil rights organizations.
Like the NAACP, yeah.
Yeah. And so despite the fact that you had, once again, consistent external pressures from people like Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Charles Diggs. They both kept up this pressure on the Department of State. There really wasn't much progress during the Eisenhower years of going beyond what the Truman years had done.
And then we reached the Kennedy Johnson years. And President Kennedy, this was a really important issue to him. Dean Rusk, as Secretary of State, said that we need to create a State Department that reflects the face of America, which is a phrase that I think just about every Secretary of State after him basically said. But that was really important to Dean Rusk. It was really important to Kennedy. Kennedy talked about the fact that there were few Black diplomats. And so one of the first things he does is he holds this Equal Employment Opportunity Summit of the State Department at the White House. Could you talk a little bit about what was the impetus or what was the pressure behind that conference? There was a 3-day conference on how do you diversify the State Department in 1961. What was the push behind that? And what were some of the things that they thought might be good ideas? And then finally, why didn't it work?
Well, the push behind the idea was, once again, external and internal pressures. You did have Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who, despite his Southern heritage, I mean, this is a fellow who came from Georgia, from an area of deeply held racist views. He had changed during his lifetime. He had worked with Ralph Bunche. And this became an issue of some importance to him. He said on several occasions during the 1950s and into the early 1960s that the issue of racism, the issue of civil rights, was one that was handicapping us around the world. But you also did have these external pressures. The civil rights movement was now growing. African-American leaders pressured the Kennedy administration and just basically said, look, we provided a lot of votes to you in this last election. We provided a lot of support, and we want to see some results. We want to see a more active interest in African affairs, for example. We want to see a more representative Foreign Service and Department of State, which, as we just noted, had really come to sort of a standstill during the Eisenhower and Dulles years. And so there really was this hope. And so, as you said, in August of 1961, there was the Conference on Equal Employment Opportunity, and that was set up by the Department of State. This was not as during the Truman years, a group of African Americans sort of coming to the White House or coming to the Department of State. They were invited for this, as you said, 3-day conference to try and find. As you said, and as Rusk put it during the meeting, he wanted a Department of State that was representative of the people of the United States.
Man, every time I hear that phrase, every time I hear that phrase, I'm like, man, that phrase is like, it's repeated a lot. It's repeated a lot, and it's mentioned so many times.
It's. Once you go through so many administrations and hear that phrase, it does start to ring a little hollow. But I think Rusk, I think this was an issue for him, and he pleaded with the African American representatives at this meeting to provide answers, solutions. What are some things we can do? And in point of fact, a number of things did emerge from that meeting.
Who were some of the people at this meeting? So I heard that there were business leaders, there were people from in-state department, there were some of the best and brightest minds who discussed diversity were at this meeting.
It was the sort of the usual suspects. There were members from the NAACP, there were members from the National Urban League, there were members from the Department of State, from the Department of State's Equal Employment Office, there were members from the press, there were members from the media, there were members from business. So this was not just some of the leading civil rights groups. This was a group of heavy hitters. And I think that was on purpose. For one thing, the State Department wanted to show that it was trying to take this idea seriously. But I think from the African American perspective, they wanted to demonstrate this is something that the African American community is interested in. Not just a handful of civil rights organizations or this or that. This is a significant issue for us.
And so what were some of the ideas that came out of that meeting? Like 3-day conference where they sat down, they fleshed out 6 or 7 really big ideas on how to tackle this lack of diversity at the State Department. What were some of those ideas?
Well, some of them seemed very small. For example, there was an agreement that emerged from this conference and was put into place by the Department of State that the Foreign Service promotion boards, those boards that met every year to see who would be promoted up the ladder of the positions in the Foreign Service, that now those Foreign Service promotion boards, and there were many of them for the different levels, each of those Foreign Service promotion boards would now have a quote unquote public member. And it was understood at the time that specifically this was aimed to ensure that there would be African American representation on these committees to try and ensure that race was not being held against people, that African Americans were getting a fair shake of promotions up through the ladder of the Foreign Service. There were a number of other proposals that were made. One of them, for example, was to use the Foreign Service Reserve program. And this was a program that was already in effect, but the Foreign Service Reserve program was really designed to take specialists from other agencies in the government or even private institutions, private companies who had specialized talents, specialized skills, and bring them into non-career appointments. And that was important. These were not Foreign Service officers. They're non-career appointments overseas, and they were also temporary. Generally speaking, these appointments for about 3 or 4 years. But the hope is that would perhaps encourage more African Americans to apply for the permanent positions in the state. They also focused on a program that, once again, was not entirely new, and that was the issue of lateral transfers. Take African Americans from other units, other offices, other agencies who have specializations in foreign policy or particular technical expertise, economics, or so forth that can be used, and take them from USIA, take them from the Agency for International Development, and bring them into the Department of State and the Foreign Service. But I think the most important one, and it was certainly the one that got the most prestige of the time and the most publicity, was the Foreign Affairs Scholars Program. One of the things that was talked about at that conference was the need to recruit more African Americans. I mean, you had to get African Americans taking the Foreign Service exam. You had to get them passing the Foreign Service exam to get into the Foreign Service. That was the idea anyway. And so in 1963, a group of people in the Department of State, including a number of African Americans from the Equal Employment Office, working with the Ford Foundation, came up with this Foreign Affairs Scholar Program. Ford Foundation put up about $600,000. And what it was supposed to do was, in essence, improve the skills of African American college students, get them the skills that they would need to pass the Foreign Service exam. And what it would do is that every year about 60 students or so would be selected as interns. And that was at least initially about 60 students, and they would have internships at the Department of State, at USIA, at AID. And after that internship, which I think was supposed to take place during their junior year, after that, they were required to take the Foreign Service exam. Now, that didn't mean they were required to join the Foreign Service, but they were required to take the exam. And they also, I think they supplied about 25 students with graduate fellowships to also encourage them to take the Foreign Service exam and show an interest in the Foreign Service.
I'm going to stop you right there, because anybody who's worked on these diversity initiatives that have just been published, all of this stuff sounds familiar, because all of this stuff has been tried before, right? So literally everything you just said is mentioned in one of these 6 reports that have been out. So clearly something happened where all these things were proposed back in the 60s, and yet we're still here talking about these same very issues, as if though they're like lateral transfers. That's something that is a huge controversy right now. But that was proposed back in the 60s. So I guess, what were some of the reasons why those ideas from the 60s did not work? Like, why, they had the will, they had the money, they had the Ford Foundation, they had the sense that they really wanted to make these things work. Why didn't any of them work?
Well, I think it was a combination. You talk about the will, and I think in 1961, 62, there was the will. But that will dissipate it to a certain extent. I mean, by 1967, the Department of State's Office of Equal Employment Opportunity issued a report in 1967, and it said this: in terms of employing more Negroes in the Foreign Service, little has been accomplished, and under present circumstances, the prospects for future advancements are quite bleak. I mean, that's just 6 years after that conference. There had been a grand increase of 2 African American Foreign Service officers during that time. No African American had entered the Foreign Service via the exam since 1963. The Foreign Service, the Foreign Affairs Scholars Program, that was floundering. Less than 100 participants had even taken the Foreign Service exam. Only 14 had passed it. And by 1967, the Ford Foundation was saying they weren't even going to fund the program anymore because it wasn't working. Of course, here's a real irony of that. The Foreign Affairs Scholars Program was supposed to increase the skills of African American students so they could pass the Foreign Service exam. But when the Ford Foundation said in 1967, well, we think we're just going to discontinue this program, the State Department's response, and this is rich. The department admitted, quote, it does not know whether this inability to pass the Foreign Service examination also reflects an inability to perform the work of a Foreign Service officer.
Yeah. They've been saying that one for like almost 60 years now. That's been a question that they haven't bothered to ask, or like to research and to look into. Well, we're going to get to that question later. What were some of the bureaucratic challenges that people faced? And so when a lot of these ideas were actually presented to actual officers, there was a level of hostility there at the State Department to any kind of opening of the doors, right?
There was. I mean, there were several problems. Even the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity said that the department simply cannot avoid the issue of minority employment simply by supporting outside efforts to improve educational opportunities. That's not going to be the answer. It also pointed out there had never been, and there still was not, in 1967, an organized department-wide equal employment opportunity program, which had the support of the department, the support of all available resources, professional expertise. And it also pointed out the fact that there was sort of what it called a vicious circle, that there were so few African Americans in the Department of State and Foreign Service that these efforts to try and attract more African Americans immediately met that issue. African Americans looking at the State Department and Foreign Service and saying, well, why are there so few African Americans in these organizations? But that issue of resistance, one of the prime examples I found, Henry Villard. Henry Villard was one of the old timers from the State Department. He joined in 1928 Foreign Service. He retired in 1961, but in 1965, in response, I think, to these efforts by the Department of State, he wrote sort of a memoir, and this is what he said. The fact is that the Foreign Service no longer prides itself on being an elite corps. It seems to pride itself on not being elite. And he complained. He said, recent efforts could mean a motley crew indeed, composed of individuals from every walk of life.
God forbid. God forbid.
Heaven forbid.
Right. And it seems like, and I remember reading that quote. And so basically to him, eliteness means whiteness, right? That's what he's saying. That's what he meant. He said that, you know what, if you let all these minorities in, then what makes us special, what makes us white will no longer be there. And if that's the mentality of Henry Villard, who was a fairly moderate person, like, and reading his biography, he was fairly moderate. But if he feels that way, then imagine how the old Southern Yale, Harvard, person must have felt at the very idea of a black officer. And in your book, you talk about how a retired ambassador had written to the Foreign Service Journal, or wrote in that letter basically saying, why does it seem like there's all these black people? It seems like half the State Department is minority. Just by having photos of black people, it really engineered this hostility among a lot of white officers in the bureaucracy that seemed to really find a way to put up as many barriers as possible to integration.
Oh yeah, those kind of responses were not unusual. Unfortunately, and even Dean Rusk, who we
Mhm.
talked about, who I think was actually interested in doing something about the issue when it came up, when that arguments, these kind of arguments were made about the elitism, the elite nature, the professional nature of the Foreign Service, the fact that you had to have the best and brightest. It ate away at Dean Rusk. I mean, what happened was that these ideas about elite and professional and qualified, it melted over into this idea that it meant a certain kind of person.
Mhm.
And other people were de facto excluded, not because of racism, not because of the color of their skin. No, it's because we have to protect the elite professional nature of the Foreign Service. And that
Yeah.
proved to sort of be Rusk's undoing, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, and I told you I read his autobiography,
Yeah.
and he was one of the few secretaries of state that actually mentioned diversity at all.
Mm.
I think he's probably the only one. Certainly, Dean Acheson did talk about it in his book. None of Eisenhower secretaries of state talked about it in their respective books. Henry Kissinger has like 1,000 pages, and you wouldn't think black people existed in America at that time. But in Dean Rusk's book, he does have like 5 pages dedicated to the diversity stuff. But he mentions two stories that really stuck out to me. The first story was that, well, whites were pretty much at the top of the State Department food chain, and blacks were relegated to messengers and secretaries and quote unquote menial jobs.
Mm.
And so he says his answer to that was that he appointed a bunch of white people to be messengers and secretaries and to do menial jobs, and in the book he's actually upset that these black people were not receptive to that. He's like, how dare these black messengers not be happy that I appointed a bunch of white messengers, because I wanted to break the stigma that only that only black people can be messengers. So I appointed a bunch of white people. And it's so funny because the book has no sense of irony in that statement at all, right? No sense of like, well, what if you had pointed like black people to some of these top positions, right?
Yeah.
And the other story that he talked about was how, he says that we looked into the Foreign Service exam, and what we discovered is that, well, black people just don't take really good tests. And so it's kind of on them. But again, without asking that question about, well, what is this test bringing you? What is this test bringing you? Does that test make a good diplomat or not? And that's something the State Department has never quite been able to answer. But so it's funny that even someone like a Dean Rusk, who started, even back, because Dean Rusk was in the State Department even back in the 40s and 50s, or in the 50s, by the time he gets to the 61, he's very supportive of these ideas. But then toward the end of his term, he's kind of done with it. He's over it. He said, you know what? I tried to appoint some black messengers and you guys, some white messengers, and you guys didn't accept that. So I'm kind of done with you all. And we have to keep the State Department, as it is. And so we switched gears into the Nixon years, which were pretty much a lull. And then we get to Carter,
Mm.
and Cyrus Vance has another task force and another report on how to reform the State Department.
Yeah. Yeah. I think describing the Nixon Kissinger years as a lull is that's a nice way of putting it.
That's a nice way to put it. That's right.
Well, Henry Kissinger said in a 1969 essay, and he was writing about the new pluralistic world that we lived in. There was a phrase he had in there, and he said, "How much diversity can we stand?" And
Yeah.
I mean, he was talking about international issues, but I think that pretty well reflected his views on diversity in state and the Foreign Service. And
Right.
Nixon, we have enough tapes of his racist spoutings to know
Yeah.
where he stood on these. And so during the Nixon Kissinger years, I think there was an increase of 0.4% in the number of African American Foreign Service officers. And it sort of led to the State Department. You said Rusk throwing up his hands. In 1983, the Department of State responded to all of these criticisms by saying, quote, "It takes time before affirmative action programs will impact at the top."
Oh my God.
So it just takes time.
It just takes time. 70 years now. They've been talking about this stuff for 70 years, but we're just going to keep on talking.
Yeah. Um,
So Cyrus Vance and the State Department tried in 76, 77 to they had a report on increasing diversity at the State Department. The 1980 Foreign Service Act, it said that its goal was to actually increase diversity, and yet during this time, there was still a lot of talk about doing stuff, but it just
yeah,
seemed to never come out.
yeah, it was the same. It was the same thing again and again. You know, in 1977, you had the Presidential Management Fellows, which was not a program designed specifically for the Department of State. It was supposed to encourage outstanding graduate students to enter government service. Um, but there was sort of an unspoken assumption that one of the areas of focus would be the Department of State, which had these issues with diversity. But when you look at that program, um, you know, most of the students were coming from the usual suspect schools: Harvard, Georgetown, Columbia. And for example, in 2017, first the Trump administration pulled state out of the Presidential Management Fellow program. And then it returned to it a couple of months later. But in 2017, there were 70 PMFs in the Department of State. It just did not. It didn't work, and it certainly didn't increase diversity. Now, the Foreign Service Act of 1980, that was a really wide-ranging act. It talked a lot about a lot of bureaucratic changes that were going to be made, but it also, once again, called for, and ready for your favorite phrase here, a foreign service more representative of the American people. And once again, though, the results were limited. Did the numbers of African Americans and women increase in the following years? That they did. To a certain extent, more so for women than for African Americans. But the old problems of pay, of promotions, of assignments and opportunities, all of that persisted. So that during the 70s and 80s, you first had the Allison Palmer lawsuit against the Department of State for gender bias. And then in 1986, you had a group of African American Foreign Service officers file suit against the Department of Foreign Service, claiming that there was discrimination in both assignments and pay and opportunities.
And in fact, there's a really great quote from that lawsuit, where the Director General of the State Department, after the lawsuits had been settled, and they had to actually promote African American officers and women officers, he said, "We have been required by the courts to promote officers, women officers, and African American officers who were not promoted by their peers under the previous system." And that is how they welcomed this idea of having a more diverse State Department. It was like we were required to do it by the courts.
Yeah.
And they really wanted, and that was really a message for ASFA and the white officers to let them know that, hey, we didn't want to promote these people, but we kind of were forced into it by the courts.
Yeah, it's. I mean, even when it was all settled, I mean, the Department of State eventually agreed. It made a monetary settlement in 1996, I believe, to a number of the African American diplomats who had filed the suit. But once again, not only didn't that settlement mollify many of the African Americans who had initially supported that effort, they said, just giving us a little bit of money here was not really the point. But it also had very little impact because of what you just said. I mean, if that's the attitude that the Department of State and Foreign Service is going to take, then you're not going to get any consistent elements of progress. There will be a show of progress for a certain amount of time till the criticisms die down, and then it will be back to business.
And George, and so we get to the 80s, Reagan years, same deal. George Shultz says in 1986, we need a State Department that better reflects the face and the values of America, but I'm not going to actually do anything about it. And even in his biography, I read his autobiography as well. The only time he mentions anything about Black people in his book is to say that, he had a staff member who had to talk to the Congressional Black Caucus, and he said they didn't lay a finger on my staff member. I was like, man, in 800 pages, that was your only mention of Black people, Blackness, and diversity. And so we get to the Clinton years, after Bush Sr., We get to the Clinton years, and Bill Clinton says, "Hey, man, we're gonna diversify the State Department. We're gonna Warren Christopher and I are gonna do this." And the reaction from the actual State Department, the president of ASFA, and others, was much of hostility.
Yeah, it's problematic.
Hmm.
Um, these efforts, since almost all of these efforts, I mean, one of the things that is key about it, almost all of these efforts come from the outside.
Hmm.
It's not the Foreign Service itself. It's not the Department of State itself that you ever see rising up and saying, "Oh my goodness, well, this is a significant problem. This is something we have to deal with right now." It's always outside pressure. It's outside pressure from African American groups. It's outside pressure from a new presidential administration that comes in. I mean, very rarely will you see
Or lawsuits among officers who've been wronged,
Yeah.
and that's really the only way that they've been able to make change. And I often think about Tex Harris, and he was the president of ASFA,
Mhm.
and he basically said, "Man, I can't believe these. We have to do more to. The president can't force us to do these affirmative action programs and let these African Americans in." And then we had the political counselor in Bolivia, who basically said that we're a bunch of, what was it, ethnic jumpers, race jumpers, and ethnic jumpers trying to climb or scam our way to the top.
Yeah.
And if that's like a political counselor writing that in a memo and in a cable, you can imagine how the other officers felt at that time. And so we have this historical context now. I'm not going to get into the later stuff, but we have this historical context of these reform efforts and these reform attempts. What are some things that you would tell to people at the State Department right now, based on this historical context? What would you tell them are the things that they need to do to actually reform the State Department or make it better?
Well, I think there's several things. Some of them are perhaps perceived as minor, but I think they would pay off. This term elite, this term professional, this term the best and the brightest, those sorts of things. They're not bad words in and of themselves, but the connotation for state and the foreign service has always been that what that translates into is elitist, that the best and the brightest are always the same people, coming from the same schools, coming from the backgrounds. And as we were just talking here, the diversity is seen as somehow diluting the professionalism, diluting the elitism. Uh, and
Instead
that,
of making them better, right? Because
yeah,
like the studies have shown that diversity and diverse populations and diverse leadership and having a diverse point of views around you actually lead to better results.
yeah,
And I think that at the State Department, you really see like this resistance, whether it because of up or out or outright racism, you really see a resistance to that.
yeah, you do. I mean, I sat on the Foreign Service promotion boards as one of the public members, and sat there during the entire program that they did on diversity. And it was long. It was an hour and a half, 2 hour program that they did just on diversity. Um, and the grumbling from people out there in the audience, and most of these are Foreign Service officers. They're
Mhm.
going to be members of these Foreign Service promotion boards about, oh, this dog and pony show. Do we have to go through this crap again? Um, uh, yeah, when you see that, when you hear those terms, ethnic jumpers, race jumpers, when you hear those kind of terms, you're not going to have any progress whatsoever. So what you have to do is you have to redefine those terms, and find other terms to explain what you really want to accomplish with the Department of State and Foreign Service. Um, and it goes back to that issue too of the Foreign Service exam. What is that thing really trying to accomplish? What should that exam be doing in terms of getting us people who would be good diplomats? Now, those questions aren't really asked. And so once again, we have a Department of State that by and large is still the same sort of views, the same sort of words, the same sort of positions, the same sort of people. Um,
Mm.
Another issue I think is we've got to move away from the idea of simply recruitment. That has been almost the be all and end all for these efforts at diversity in the past. Is, well, we just need to recruit more African Americans. That's not a bad idea, of course, uh,
Right.
but I think about those kind of efforts, and I think about here in North Carolina. We produce here at Appalachian, we produce lots and lots of teachers. Um,
Mhm.
and the entire school, the university system produces thousands of teachers every year. But every year we hear about a teacher shortage. Well, why? It's because, yeah, they're recruiting thousands and thousands and thousands of teachers. But on the other end, you see thousands and thousands and thousands of people leaving each year because it's not what they were told. They're treated like crap. Their pay is awful. So what you have here is with recruitment, it's just like filling up a bucket that has holes in it. You can keep pouring people into it, but if you can't keep people there,
Mhm.
if you can't promote people, if you can't, if you can't put people into positions of power, if you can't give them the idea that this is going to be a career for them, then none of that really matters. Another thing, it got to stop focusing on these short-term answers, these short-term programs. This is going to be a long-term process. Um, when you think of diversifying a massive institution, and academia would be a perfect example of how a large scale institution really had to almost be forced to engage with these issues of diversity over the decades. It's going to be a long term process. But what happens, as we just discussed, presidential administration will come in, somebody will come in, somebody will say, look, there's a big problem. Gosh, let's set up some programs. Those programs sort of fall by the wayside. The administration loses interest. The next administration comes in, cleans house. Maybe it follows through, maybe it doesn't follow through, and so most of these efforts that we just talked about have been almost completely forgotten. They were set up with all sorts of celebration, all sorts of, oh, this is going to be the answer. Um, and then I think a couple of other things is the state and the Foreign Service have to be educated. And I'm sure that will not ring ring well in many ears, but they have to be educated to why this is an important issue and why this continues to be a problem. Um, after our first conversation, I spoke to some State Department organizations around the world. I had a number of State Department people and Foreign Service officers writing me about their personal experiences, but almost all of them said that they had no idea about these issues, about the history that we discussed in our last talk. That's got to become part of the training. That's got to become part of the learning curve for any diplomat. But also, there has to be part of that education that this is not simply a civil rights issue, although it certainly is. This is not simply an issue of fairness. This is not simply an issue of equality. This is an issue that's important to our diplomacy. We have a world that is deeply suspicious of the United States, especially after many of the latest racial problems. This is something that will make our diplomacy better, that will make our standing in the world better. And I just don't think there's any doubt about that.
Mhm. No, I agree with you. If anybody ever asked me like what were some of the things that I've learned just from talking to you and a lot of historical research, I think that the first thing is I would tell every State Department person, you know what, take a month off and read the biographies and autobiographies of the people who've run the State Department and find me the America that they live in. Because it's not the actual America, right? Like you could read Dean Russ's book, you could read Henry Kissinger's book, and you would have never known there was a civil rights movement in the United States. You would have never known there was a women's rights movement in the United States. You would never even know there was any kind of race issues in the United States by just reading the biographies and autobiographies of the people who actually run our institutions of foreign policy and domestic policy. And it's like that, like Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. And I think if you read these biographies, if you don't see any mention of race, and if you see no mention of diversity, then that's how much it mattered to them. If it hasn't mattered to anybody at State Department for basically 70 years, Dean Acheson had that meeting with several African American leaders. That isn't mentioned in President at the Creation, not mentioned in any of his books. And if I ever had a chance to talk to Tony Blinken or the people or the chief diversity officer or any people around, I would ask, so when is that first black person or woman appear in your autobiography one day?
Mm.
When is the first time that you have an awareness that this is an issue, right? And is it on page 500, 600? Is it mentioned at all? Is it in the back of the book? Is it in the front of the book? And so if you see diversity as ancillary, if you see it as something that's secondary, if you see it as something that's something to be checked off, nothing's ever going to change. It has to be central or darn near central to an issue that we care about and we're passionate about at the State Department, you know? And I think the second thing I would say is, you know, before you double the number of Pickerings, before you double the number of Wrangles, double the number of historians at the State Department and make the office of the historian do policy, do research to educate officers and educate the State Department on the history of the State Department. Because I think a lot of people go into these meetings and we have like these task force and these committee meetings. We come up with great ideas, not realizing that someone 60 years ago came up with the same idea. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do the idea again, but before we tackle that, we should have an understanding and a basis of why it didn't work the first time we tried it. We can try it again, but let's find out why it doesn't work, you know? And so I think that before we go and expand the numbers for recruitment, we need to really work on retention, and we really need to work on our understanding, our historical knowledge and the historical context of our understanding. And the last thing I think is data is so important. I think that we at the State Department, they really debate over even data. You know, they debate over, well, do we have a problem? Do we not have a problem? What is the efficacy of the Foreign Service exam? Is it really necessary? There's so many things at state that we take to be sacrosanct, but we don't actually know why we do those things and why those things matter and why they're important. If you can't tell me why we have a Foreign Service exam within three, and even like the idea that, you know, well, we have to have this exam because of elitism, but why is Harvard and Yale and other why are these universities moving away from exams, right? Like they're supposed to be the top of the elites, the super elites, and they find these exams to be pointless. So why are we still doing that? And I'm not saying that I want to get rid of the Foreign Service exam. I just want a better understanding of why do we have this exam and what result are we trying to produce with it, you know? And I also think that we need to support those institutional entrepreneurs. We need to support those people within the State Department, and they need to be talking to people outside of the State Department. We need to do oral histories and oral stories. We need to talk to Allison Palmer. We need to talk to these people who sued the State Department in the 90s, and we need to have that broad-based understanding of our history and our context. And I think that that's what would encourage people to move in the right direction. And I think that just having that understanding is the foundation for any kind of reform that we want to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would be very interesting for a lot of the folks coming into diplomacy would be to look at a lot of those oral histories, for example, at the ADST, of former African American ambassadors, diplomats, and the stories they have to tell of the fights they had to have. I mean, you know, Terrence Todman has to fight just to eat in a desegregated lunchroom. This isn't known. This isn't perceived, and so without that kind of knowledge, and yeah, the Foreign Service exam. I remember in graduate school, one of my friends showed me a copy they'd gotten somewhere of the Foreign Service exam, and I'm just flipping through it. There was a picture of a building, and it said, "What architect designed this?"
It's still on there.
I was like, well,
like that,
because that's the only one I know. But I didn't think about it at the time. But as we've been talking more here, I was going, what did that matter? That someone could name the architect of that building.
And I think back to our first conversation about the Negro circuit and how they were successful at that. And you really had Chester Bowles and Ambassador Dudley basically saying, okay, I am looking for action. I'm going to get something done, and we're going to get from point A to point B without committee hearings and without task force and without like I think that what Chester Bowles was trying to say back then was that I don't want to leave a meeting talking about diversity without some kind of action on it. Because I think a lot of times, and you mentioned this in your book, that there was a black diplomat who said that the State Department finds a way to talk itself out of always making change. That's the answer, is that they talk about something and they talk about it and they talk about it and they talk about it. They come up with all the reasons why they shouldn't do it. And then they're like, well, we're just not going to do it because it's just too hard. And I think that that's what has really hurt the State Department in a lot of ways.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think you look back at those years of Dudley and
One of my former bosses said the answer is I am pay. That's why he. That's why he was my boss.
it probably was. But you look back to that period, that was, once again, one of these things we've been talking about. That came from inside. Yes, there were the external pressures. There were the African American newspapers, magazines, the meeting with Truman, the meeting with Atchison. But the real change, the solid change that came out of all that talk, was those men within the Department of State just hammering away at that issue until, as you said, they got action. Not a report, not a blue ribbon panel. They got action. Stop assigning African Americans to the same post. Assign somewhere else, and that's what happened. And it seemed that seemed a small change at the time, but those kind of changes are what lead to larger changes instead of it just being, shucked away in somebody's file folder somewhere.
Yep. Yep. And I think that's like, and even like, whoever the new chief diversity officer is going to be, we should probably compile for them every single report, 70 years worth of reports written on this topic, just to read them and to understand just how like this has been such an issue for the State Department. But I really do believe, and I really hope that this time it's going to be different, that this is the time when we're going to see change, not just at the State Department, but across the United States on this issue of race and inequality, and how do we make a more equitable and just society. I'm an eternal optimist, and so if you could have a conversation with this chief diversity officer, whoever he or she might be one day, or they might be, what would be some of the things you would tell them that they need to work on immediately?
Well, they've got to build an infrastructure within state and the Foreign Service. It can't just be one person. It can't just be one office. And it can't be something that the next administration, if they lose interest, it just goes away. If you can build an infrastructure within those institutions that have, as not perhaps not their only job, but the majority of their job is to see to it that the problems are addressed, not just recruitment, but the problems inside state, inside Foreign Service, the problems of promotions, the problem of assignments, the problems of channeling people into these career tracks that lead to dead-end careers. That's got to be something that's there every single day, and not just one person, because one person can be overwhelmed awfully quickly. Build that infrastructure, and build the infrastructure not just in terms of setting up offices and setting up agencies and putting people behind desks, but making this a living part of the Department of State or Foreign Service. And as I said, I think that really begins with education. Anyone coming in to these institutions has got to be a part of their training process, has got to be not only that this has been an issue, not only that there have been these terrific problems, not only has this been a consistent issue for decades and decades, but also, try to instill in the individuals who come in that this is an important issue for U.S. diplomacy. Yes, it is a civil rights issue. Yes, it is a basic issue of equality and so forth. But this is a foreign policy issue. This is a diplomatic handicap for the United States, that we don't have a more diverse foreign service and State Department, and literally pound that into those institutions, so that once that person leaves, once an administration leaves, if anybody wants to try and root that out, they're really going to have to work hard, because it's part and parcel of that institution instead of being forced from the outside. So.
Absolutely right. And I think I would tell them the same thing. I would tell them, like, whoever they might be, I would tell them, you know what, you should expect that the next president is going to be hostile to this. That the next president is not, and we may never have another president who cares about this again. You might be the last chief diversity and inclusion officer. And you need to have that kind of mentality. And, honestly, I would say that on anybody who's working in government right now. You should assume that you are the last person who's going to love this job, whether it's immigration or Justice Department or anything. You should assume you're the last one ever. And you should act accordingly to that. And so I think that's going to be also true of the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer as well. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for coming on and talking a little bit about this issue. I'm sure that you and I will talk again, but hopefully once we get the new Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer in, we can talk again about maybe some of the things that they've taken on and how those relate to history.
That would be great. That would be great. Yeah, it's, we'll both try to end on an optimistic note.
That's right. All right. Thanks everyone for listening on Facebook and on YouTube.
Okay.
I'm going to sign off.
Okay.
Thanks
Thanks, Chris.
everybody. Mhm.